The starting line. Childhood in my sister's shadow. Growing up in Cedar Falls, Iowa, a little town where everyone knows your business. My life was more or less scripted, long before I realized I even had a role to play. My name is Madison Taylor, and I'm the second daughter in a family where being the little sister wasn't just a biological fact. It was a definition forced upon me by circumstances and, most of all, by my older sister, Brooklyn. People in town called us the Taylor girls, but they always meant her, the tall, dazzling, straight-A student with the gap-toothed grin that made adults rave about how she'd go places. From as far back as I can remember, Brooklyn had this gravitational pull. She controlled the room with her stories and her laughter, commanding attention the way a sun commands its orbiting planets. At 6, I thought it was magic. At 10, it started feeling suffocating. Looking back now, I realize it was less magic and more elaborate choreography. Each step designed by her, each line delivered with purpose, every glance from our parents orchestrated to see her as the golden child. And there I was, orbiting in the periphery, learning how to fit myself around her shine. Home wasn't a battleground, not in the classic sense. There were no slammed doors or open rivalries. Instead, manipulation lived quietly in our house, like a ghost that only I could see. Brooklyn was all charm in front of Mom and Dad, but with me, there were always little digs, a sarcastic comment about my messy hair, a reminder at bedtime that not everyone can be special, Maddie. It wasn't just what she said, but how she said it. Whenever something went wrong, a broken vase, a bad grade, it was uncanny how she steered suspicion my way with what seemed like innocent observations. Are you sure you didn't forget to close the window, Maddie? Or, well, Madison does leave her things everywhere. Each time, our parents' eyes would flicker toward me, just a beat longer than to her. The world outside our home followed Brooklyn's narrative, too. At school, teachers asked me if I was anything like my big sister, Brooklyn. I quickly learned that, like Brooklyn, was the gold standard. It meant being invited to sleepovers and picked first in gym. It meant teachers smiled at you by default. The comparison became a kind of second skin. I didn't choose it, but I couldn't take it off either. And on lonely nights in our shared room, I'd lie awake listening to Brooklyn's even breathing, wondering if my sister ever felt the weight of being watched, of being measured, as I did every single day. To cope, I developed habits. I became an observer, always alert for the changes in Brooklyn's moods, in the subtle shifts in our parents' expectations. I learned to anticipate where I might be blamed, preparing excuses before they were ever needed. I grew quiet, hoping invisibility might equal safety. But invisibility is lonely when you're a kid craving approval, when you want your own light instead of borrowed glimmers. My childhood was not thunderous. It was years of silent calculations, small retreats, and watching the world gravitate to my sister's orbit, while I tried, desperately, not to spin out. The early days of manipulation. I wish I could say the rivalry between Brooklyn and me was simple. Typical sisterly squabbling, petty fights over toys, or the last slice of pizza. But as I replay my elementary school years in Cedar Falls, things come back sharper and more vivid, layers peeling away to show truths I once didn't have words for. Brooklyn's talent for getting her way was more than just sibling pecking order. It was a finely honed skill of subtle push and pull, the way a puppeteer works strings hidden behind a velvet curtain. In those early years, it seemed like Brooklyn had an endless supply of tricks. She knew exactly when to play the doting sister in front of Mom, helping me with my backpack, brushing my hair gently, reading storybooks aloud in syrupy tones, just loud enough for our parents to overhear. But once the grown-ups' backs were turned, her voice shifted. It went from soft to steely, from supportive to cutting. "Try not to mess up so much today, okay?" she'd whisper, her words sticking to me like static electricity. I remember the dread in my stomach whenever something went missing around the house. A TV remote, a favorite mug, Dad's car keys. Brooklyn would smooth her hair, adopt her most innocent smile, and say, "Maybe Madison moved it? She's always leaving things everywhere." It was so plausible that our parents barely questioned it. It was easier to believe the story, presented by the child who always had her homework squared away and never talked back. The little schemes grew bolder at school. If I argued back or tried to call out her lies, Brooklyn would laugh it off and turn the class against me with a pointed joke about how Madison's just dramatic. If I managed to do well on a test, she found a way to belittle the achievement. Maybe it was a fluke. Maybe the teacher helped me. Maybe I only got lucky. The more I tried to stand my ground, the more she closed in, making sure I always felt 2 steps behind. Friends, too, were never quite my own. Brooklyn seemed determined to fold anyone I confided in into her own circle. She could make me feel invisible in a crowd, leaving me stranded on the playground, pretending she didn't see me wave. Sometimes I wondered if our whole neighborhood had bought into her version of me, the bumbling little sister eternally in need of rescue, or more often, to blame for the day's mess. What stung most wasn't being accused or misunderstood. It was learning to anticipate every move. I started coming up with mental checklists, triple-checking my chores, keeping my things lined up neat, rehearsing explanations for mistakes I hadn't yet made. I became so risk-averse that I think I lost some of my own spark. Self-doubt settled in early, shaping how I moved through the halls at school, how I offered hesitant answers in class, how I never raised my hand unless I was absolutely sure. Looking back, I see clearly how those early manipulations shaped both Brooklyn and me. She got stronger, testing just how far her words could travel and what influence she could wield. I got quieter, a little sharper every year, saving up all these small learnings without knowing what they'd someday mean. Now, I realize those long-ago days weren't just about my sister's power. They were about how I learned to survive, and eventually, how I'd learn to fight back. The pressures of adolescence. If my childhood was defined by quietly scrambling to adjust myself to fit inside Charlotte's carefully constructed world, then adolescence was a whole new kind of crucible. By the time I started high school at 16, our little town had grown even smaller. If you asked me then, I would have told you that life in Morgan Falls was like living in a snow globe, beautiful from a distance, but suffocatingly sealed, with every movement shaken up and watched by everyone else. High school was where Charlotte's talent for manipulation matured into something more sophisticated. By then, she was a senior, and I was just another freshman finding my way through crowded hallways, hoping not to get trampled by upperclassmen or lost in the tide of social hierarchies. Charlotte seemed to glide through it all. Captain of the debate team, editor-in-chief of the school paper, surrounded by a loyal clique whose loyalty was, I'd come to realize, more about allegiance than friendship. For the first months, she largely ignored me at school, only offering the occasional wave if we passed in the hall. At home, it was a different story. Our parents faced mounting work stress and seemed grateful for Charlotte's reliability. She always had her homework done, her college applications pristine, her volunteer hours logged. My struggles, a bad grade in geometry, a missed assignment, an awkward attempt to join the soccer team, barely registered by comparison. At the dinner table, Every conversation seemed to orbit around her. Scholarship applications, prom plans, a glowing letter from the principal. But the real trouble started when Charlotte discovered the power of social media. When we were younger, her schemes were local. Whispers at home, rumors on the playground, stories spun to relatives. With Instagram and Snapchat, her reach multiplied. I didn't post much, but even a single picture with friends could draw out sly comments from her, sometimes direct, sometimes indirect. "Careful, Liv. You might want to use a filter next time," she'd comment publicly, sometimes deleting it, leaving me to fend off questions about what she meant from classmates. Other times, she'd post perfect pictures of herself, tagging me, absent-mindedly in stories that made me look clueless or out of place. Even worse were the moments when Charlotte weaponized adult worries against me. If I came home late from the library, it became a topic of concern for my parents. Not just worry, but suspicion, carefully seeded by Charlotte's innocent questions. "Olivia, are you sure you're not hanging out with the wrong crowd?" Or, "Mom, did you know Liv's friend's party got pretty wild last weekend?" She had never been there, but the way she placed doubt in our parents' minds was genius in its subtlety. I watched my mother's anxiety ratchet up, my father's tone become impatient. It didn't matter that my grades were fine, that I was working hard. In their eyes, the seed had been planted. Olivia is the wild one, perhaps even the troubled one. At school, the isolation grew. Charlotte's charisma was legendary. Her friends became my acquaintances by default, but never truly trusted me. Sometimes, friends I'd made on my own would drift away, seemingly overnight. I'd find out later it was because Charlotte had warned them that I could be dramatic, or that I was going through a rough patch. I confronted one girl, Anna, after she'd suddenly stopped replying to my texts, and she just shrugged. "Your sister said you needed space." I didn't want to make it worse. I can't overstate the loneliness of that time. It was as if I wore an invisible sign on my back, painted by Charlotte, declaring me undependable, a sign everyone else could see except me. I withdrew. I kept my head down, did my homework late into the night, rarely raised my hand unless I felt absolutely certain of the answer. Eventually, my world shrank to one or two friends Charlotte deemed unworthy of her attention, and therefore, mercifully, safe from her orbit. In that fluorescent-lit pressure cooker of high school, I learned the art of survival. I started carrying notebooks, jotting down details like a detective. Who said what and when? Who seemed to be drifting away, and why? I listened more than I spoke. I became an observer, cataloging micro-expressions, memorizing the tone of voice that meant genuine kindness versus calculated performance. One time in sophomore year, I discovered Charlotte had spread a rumor that I'd cheated on a biology test. Even my teacher hesitated to believe me, asking probing questions about my study habits, my recent grades. It nearly broke me, but the experience taught me the value of documentation, of evidence. I kept emails, screenshots, and notes. I learned to protect myself, not with confrontation, which rarely worked against Charlotte's polish, but with a quiet, icy resolve. At home, I tried to talk to my parents about what was happening, but the conversations never ended well. "Don't be so sensitive," my mom would say. Or, "Charlotte loves you, Liv. Maybe you're reading into things." Their denial, though, well-meaning, only deepened my sense of isolation. It was as if I was living in a parallel world, a world where my reality, my feelings, were visible only to me. This stoking pressure, both from Charlotte and my parents' blind spots, could have crushed me. But there was a small, stubborn core in me that grew stronger with each slight. I saw, again and again, that the world did not exist just to please Charlotte Harris. She had simply convinced people, temporarily, that her version of events was the only truth. I realized that if I ever wanted to escape, to live as something more than her supporting character, I would need to outgrow my own fear of loneliness. I would need to use every ounce of that quiet, observant energy to build a resilience she could never touch. Adolescence for me wasn't about rebellion, but quiet preparation. I became sharper, colder on the inside, determined to outlast the storm. By the time Charlotte graduated and left for college, I was still the shy shadow in everyone's eyes. But underneath, I was learning who I was and what it might feel like to step into the sun, finally, on my own terms. The turning point, going away to college in the heart of Chicago, was the first true moment I could call my own. It was as if the air itself changed, sharper with independence, humming with the possibility of reinvention. Far from Maplewood, where the Harrison name preceded me, I was finally just Emily, no shadow trailing behind me, no measuring stick held to every achievement, no sister nearby to claim the spotlight or shift the blame. The transition started small. My freshman dorm room overlooked a jagged stretch of city skyline. At night, the hum of traffic replaced the soft lull of suburban crickets. It was disorienting at first, lonely even. For the first time, I realized how much of myself I'd kept locked away, not just from others, but from myself. I had spent so long on high alert, bracing for the next twist of Jessica's words, or the quiet disappointment in my parents' eyes, that living without that constant pressure felt almost unsafe. At first, I moved quietly through campus life, watching, observing, measuring, before speaking, but the city doesn't wait for anyone to catch up, and that urgency began to prod me out of my shell. The skills I'd honed at home, reading people, noticing patterns, picking up on unspoken cues, slowly became assets, not liabilities. I often surprised myself by how easily I could read a room, sensing when someone needed a friend or when a tense group project required mediation. I became the person others sought out for advice or support. I joined a creative writing workshop in my first semester, more for anonymity than ambition. The instructor, a gruff poet with ink-stained hands, encouraged vulnerability on the page. The first time I read a story aloud, one threaded with themes of manipulation and sibling rivalry, I half expected the same skepticism I'd grown used to at home. Instead, the room fell silent in that charged, affirming way. That means people actually heard you. Afterward, classmates approached me, relating their own stories of complicated siblings and imperfect families. For the first time, I wasn't isolated by my experience. I was connected by it. Friendships blossomed in fits and starts. I made mistakes, trusting too quickly, withdrawing when old insecurities surged, making assumptions that weren't fair. But Chicago was forgiving in its own rushing, bustling way. Roommates became confidants, and the acceptance that eluded me for so long started to settle around me, gossamer thin but strengthening day by day. I began to understand that being quiet was not synonymous with being weak. It could mean watchfulness, empathy, and the kind of steadfastness that holds people together when louder voices falter. Jessica, meanwhile, called occasionally, buoyant as ever, assuming my world still revolved around hers. She'd share dramatic tales of college life back east, sometimes probing gently for details of my own setbacks or triumphs. But I noticed something subtle shift in our exchanges. She no longer seemed so certain of her grip on me, as if geographic distance had weakened her narrative thread. I recognized the small satisfaction this brought, tinged with guilt and a bittersweet sense of justice. At the end of that first year, I visited home for the summer. Jessica was there, status unchanged, her bedroom a shrine to past victories. But I saw her differently. Her words, once so sharp and precise in their impact, now seemed carefully rehearsed, almost brittle. I watched how our parents responded, still enamored, but with a faint undercurrent of fatigue, as if her demands had grown heavier even for them. When Jessica attempted her old routines, teasing me in front of relatives, downplaying my academic successes, I responded not with silence, but with calm, unflappable honesty. I called out subtle twists in her stories, corrected exaggerations, and did so without anger, only clarity. It was thrilling and vulnerable, a performance of truth instead of retreat. That summer marked a pivot. Our family dinners were no longer dominated by Jessica's perspective alone. Sometimes, my parents even sought my opinion, asking about my writing, my friends, my work in the city. Jessica noticed the shift, and while she bristled at the lost territory, she could not reclaim her old dominance, at least not in front of me. The outcome wasn't a dramatic reversal or a single cathartic moment, but a slow, persistent change in the air. Returning to college that fall, I felt different, subtly, powerfully transformed. I had found not just refuge in distance, but a realignment of my self-worth. My story was no longer a reaction to Jessica's. It was a narrative I authored with intention. I knew then that power, once yielded, could not so easily be reclaimed by those who once wielded it over you. In discovering my own voice, I hadn't just escaped Jessica's shadow. I had learned how to create my own light, not by eclipsing hers, but by being unmistakably, unapologetically myself, the counterstrike. Looking back, I realized the seeds for my counterstrike against Brooke were sown the day I finally stepped out of her shadow in Chicago. But it didn't happen all at once. Plotting my own comeback was more like watching a slow sunrise break through a fog of past disappointments. I came home after college with new angles, new armor, and a determination not just to survive, but to reclaim pieces of my life that had always been under her control. My reputation, my relationships, even my sense of self. I'll admit, walking through the front door that first summer, I felt a storm of emotions. There was nostalgia, yes, but also dread. The sense that at any moment I might slip back into old patterns, become the timid, apologetic version of myself. Brooke greeted me with her signature blend of sweetness and scrutiny, a hug that lingered a moment too long, a quick scan of my hair, my clothes, looking for weaknesses. Once, that would have left me shrinking, arms crossed, avoiding eye contact. Now, I met her gaze head on and smiled. The stakes were different. She could sense it, I think. The first battle lines were drawn at the dinner table, where old dynamics lingered under a fresh coat of small talk. Brooke spun her stories for my parents, painting herself as the responsible daughter, glossing over any hint of imperfection. Usually, I would sit silently, letting her narrative fill the room, but not anymore. When she misrepresented facts, like claiming she'd helped me find my first apartment in Chicago, she hadn't. I calmly corrected her. Actually, I found it through a college network. It took a lot of phone calls, but it was worth it. The conversation paused, and for a brief second, the room seemed to tilt in my direction. My parents glanced at me, surprised, then nodded. Brooke's jaw tightened. She didn't argue, but the air changed. Over that summer, I became strategic with my actions. If Brooke threw subtle barbs, I dodged them with humor, or called her out with careful, unshakable facts. When she tried to blame me for a minor family mishap, misplacing the car keys, for example, I shrugged. I'm happy to help look, but you were the last one with the keys, Brooke. It was such a small thing, but for years, I would have let that accusation sink in. Let my parents' suspicions flicker toward me. This time, responsibility landed squarely on Brooke, and she had no way to spin it. I started reclaiming relationships, too. My parents and I went out for coffee, just the three of us, a rarity in my childhood home, where everything social revolved around my sister. I shared stories from college, difficult classes, friendships, struggles, and triumphs. I told them when I was proud of myself, or when things were hard. Instead of shrinking my experiences to fit into the spaces left by Brooke's tales, I filled the room with my own presence. I could see something gentle shifting in my parents' faces. For maybe the first time, they saw me not just as Brooke's little sister, but as someone independent, resilient, worth knowing on her own terms. Other relationships shifted too. Whenever Brooke and I were at family gatherings or caught up with childhood friends, I let her lead the conversations, as she was used to, but I paid close attention. I picked up on her old tactics, how she'd slyly twist past events or exaggerate her role in group stories. I learned to steer conversations gently, correcting details with grace. Sometimes I'd say, I remember it differently, and offer my perspective. The group would listen, and more often than not, those soft corrections began to weave a new version of our shared history. Slowly, people started asking me for my take, including me naturally in the conversation. Brooke noticed. I could see her appraising me, as if measuring how much influence she'd really lost. But it went deeper than just words. I felt bolder inside and out. Instead of dodging conflict, I pointed out when things felt unfair. If Brooke made a joke at my expense, I met her eyes and replied, "That's not exactly fair, is it?" Not angrily, just matter of fact. The first few times, she brushed it off. But as it kept happening, as I held my ground, others began to notice. No one likes a bully when the victim stands tall and refuses to shrink. I also made a conscious effort to connect with people Brooke had once tried to bring into her sphere of influence: cousins, old family friends, neighbors. In the past, her hold over group dynamics was practically unbreakable. If she complimented someone, everyone followed suit. If she turned on someone, it became a silent consensus to avoid them. Now, I reached out to those people one-on-one. I offered genuine interest in their lives, asked questions, and really listened. It was a revelation, both for them and for me. Aunt Sarah, who used to see me as shy and forgetful, confided that she always wondered if Brooke's stories about me were exaggerated. Our neighbor, Mrs. Fletcher, told me she was proud of the person I was becoming. I didn't go in with the intent to turn anyone against my sister. What I wanted was clarity, truth, and relationships built on authenticity. But as that authenticity grew, something subtle started to change in the air. People spent more time talking to me, inviting me along to things where, before, they'd default to Brooke. I even noticed some of Brooke's closest childhood friends confiding in me, sharing their frustrations about how she'd treated them too. It was as if my courage to draw boundaries gave others permission to do the same. There were awkward moments. At one family barbecue, Brooke told a story about how I once ruined our neighbor's garden by knocking over a bag of seed, an old tale she'd exaggerated for laughs. Instead of laughing along, I simply said, "Actually, I remember trying to help you, and the bag slipped, but we cleaned it up together, remember?" My calmness rattled her. A few people exchanged glances. The laughter was softer, uncertain. Brooke tried to change the subject, but the power in that moment had shifted. Small victories piled up, piece by piece, until suddenly I realized I was no longer reacting. I was leading. That summer, I also began documenting my experiences in a journal. Something just for me, a place to process what was happening and track the changes I felt, both internally and externally. I realized the years of hypervigilance and self-doubt Brooke had instilled had made me perceptive, intentional, aware. Instead of being weapons she could use against me, those traits became my strengths. I was a better listener, a sharper observer. I could see emotional undercurrents long before others did. My intuition, shaped by survival, became a superpower. There was one pivotal afternoon, weeks before I returned to Chicago, when everything crystallized. Brooke was trying to orchestrate a petty family drama. She claimed I'd promised to drive Mom to her doctor's appointment, when Brooke had actually volunteered and forgotten. She announced it in front of everyone, her voice all concern and innocence. Old me would have panicked or sputtered, but this time I simply pulled out a calendar app and showed my notes. We agreed last Sunday Brooke would handle it. I have it right here. My parents looked at her for an explanation. Brooke, unsettled, waved it off with a small, brittle laugh. It was the first time I saw her facade falter in public. The power imbalance was broken. These were not big, cinematic victories. They were dozens, maybe hundreds, of small, measured steps, correcting false narratives, refusing to play a role in her dramas, holding ground in conversations, and showing up for people, even when it was uncomfortable. Every action was deliberate, every encounter a test. What surprised me was how quickly the ripple effects spread. My parents began confiding in me more, asking for my perspective, entrusting me with responsibilities I'd never been given before. When disagreements flared up, over money, family plans, whatever, the old script of siding with Brooke started to break. Sometimes the shift felt fragile, like it might collapse at any moment. But each time I stood up for myself, it grew stronger. I started to feel a confidence I'd never experienced as a child or teen. For the first time, I believed that my version of events mattered. Brooke, confronted with the new dynamic, tried to escalate at first. She would make snide remarks under her breath, test boundaries, and sometimes even explode in frustration. But the family was no longer buying her act, at least not blindly. We had crossed into unknown territory, and Brooke realized that if she wanted to be heard, she needed to play fair or be ignored. The more she insisted on spinning old stories, the more isolated she became. The beautiful symmetry of it struck me. The more I owned my narrative, the less room there was for hers to dominate. The best part was that I didn't have to become someone else or stoop to her level. I didn't seek revenge for the old wounds. I simply refused to carry them any longer. If Brooke ever wondered why she lost her allies or why others became distant, the answer was always the same. People prefer authenticity. They crave it. When given a real choice, friends and family choose honesty, connection, and respect over manipulation every single time. By the end of that summer, my counterstrike was undeniable. Brooke herself seemed aware of it, as much as she tried to pretend otherwise. Her jokes fell flat, her attempts at taking credit seemed forced, and her control over the family narrative slipped. Little by little, she started withdrawing, becoming less vocal at family events, opting out of group outings, behaviors I recognized all too well from my own years of isolation. But I didn't take pleasure in her discomfort. I felt a strange mix of empathy and relief. Empathy for her vulnerability, because I'd lived it too, and relief that I'd broken free from the cycle. I wish I could say we had a dramatic confrontation, or that everything tied itself up into a tidy, Hollywood ending. We didn't, but the story I reclaimed and rewrote became the foundation for everything that came next. Brooke and I learned, maybe for the first time, to coexist as equals. My relationships flourished. My parents trusted me. I stood taller every day. I found freedom not in defeating Brooke, but in realizing my life never truly belonged to her in the first place. My counterstrike was quiet, steady, and ultimately, it was mine. The unavoidable consequences. If you had told me back when I was a kid, scurrying through the Taylor hallway, second-guessing every step in my older sister's shadow, that the day would come when the tables actually turned, I'd have thought you were telling me a fairy tale. But life, in a way I never anticipated, finds its own balance. Actions sprout consequences, slowly at first, and then so rapidly you can barely keep up. As much as I wanted freedom from Brooklyn's control, realizing what that freedom actually looked like, with her at its losing end, proved more complicated than I could have possibly imagined. It started small, as these things do. After the summer of my counterstrike, I saw a subtle withdrawal in Brooklyn that went far deeper than the petty sulking she did as a child. Suddenly, her laugh at family dinners became forced. Her stories, once so enthralling, began to ring hollow, and my parents started noticing it too. I could see them glancing at her with confusion, or was it frustration, as they weighed my calm honesty against her old dramatics. The power dynamic had shifted, and the currents running through our home felt changed in some invisible but permanent way. What surprised me wasn't just Brooklyn's reaction, but the way everyone else responded. Friends and relatives who had once hung on her every word now invited me to events, asked for my advice, and included me in things where I'd been the perennial afterthought. Brooklyn noticed the shift, and I can only imagine the shock and sting. A kind of social exile that mirrored what I'd felt for years. For so long, she'd been at the center of every gathering. Now, she watched from the edges as others gravitated away from her sphere of influence, seeking out my company for sincerity and warmth she'd never bothered to cultivate. At first, I felt a pang of guilt. Wasn't this what I'd always wanted? To be seen, finally, for who I was. And yet, watching Brooklyn's discomfort as she tried, and failed, to reclaim her old role was oddly bittersweet. I recalled a childhood spent scavenging for approval, twisting myself into someone quieter, smaller, just to survive her orbit. Now the loneliness I'd known had somehow moved into her life. The symmetry would have been poetic if it weren't so human and messy. Brooklyn's isolation deepened. She stopped inviting people over, started declining invitations, showing up late and leaving early at family events. Our parents asked me more and more about my feelings and opinions, their trust in my judgment growing. Other relatives, sensing the social winds had changed, started confiding in me about their own uneasy memories of Brooklyn's manipulations, things they had shrugged off for years. The stories spilled out. The time she embarrassed a cousin at a family reunion, the years she played favorites among the neighborhood kids. It was as if her carefully constructed facade was unspooling for everyone to see, thread by thread. But this reckoning wasn't an act of revenge. I hadn't set out to punish Brooklyn. I just needed space to become my own person. Still, consequences ricochet, and Brooklyn felt the brunt of a backlash she'd never thought possible. I watched her grapple with the realization that relationships don't come from dominance. They grow from compassion, vulnerability, and respect. Her old methods of control no longer landed. She grew quieter, defensive, sometimes even tearful. The sister I'd once feared seemed suddenly fragile, wavering at the edges of the family nucleus she'd once ruled. To my surprise, my parents handled the fallout with a kind of wary compassion. They didn't gloat over Brooklyn's new meekness, but neither did they rush to rescue her. Instead, they encouraged open discussions, gently nudging us both toward understanding. When Brooklyn lashed out, accusing me of turning people against her, I responded with honesty. "I just stopped letting you rewrite my story, Brooklyn. People decided for themselves. The truth, delivered plainly, had a power all its own." There were moments, of course, when pain bubbled up. At a Thanksgiving dinner, Brooklyn tried to reclaim her old throne, regaling the table with stories that soon faltered mid-sentence. People's attention drifted toward me, their questions about my work and city life flowing naturally. I glimpsed the hurt on Brooklyn's face and felt a strange swirl of pity and relief. It was proof that justice, when it arrives, so often runs parallel to heartbreak, for both the person who wins and the one who loses. Brooklyn's closest friends dwindled away. A few reached out to me in private, apologizing for the years they'd looked past her tactics. Others simply drifted, perhaps unable to reconcile the sister they once admired with the truths now laid bare. The loss was visible in Brooklyn's posture, the way she'd shrink into silence on the porch swing or offer help in the kitchen, but linger at the edge, untethered. There was no singular moment of reckoning, no showdown, no teary apology that tied everything up in a perfect bow. The consequences unfolded over months, coloring every aspect of family life. Brooklyn's withdrawal made holidays quieter, family get-togethers less boisterous. Our parents sometimes asked if I'd reach out to her, hoping for reconciliation. When I did, it was with careful boundaries. No more biting sarcasm, no taking the blame for her missteps, no erasing myself for the sake of peace. I learned during this time how complicated empathy could be, how easy it is to mistake being right for being righteous, and how pain, even when deserved, rarely feels noble when you see it up close. Sometimes I wondered what my life might have looked like had we both been seen for who we really were, not just the roles we'd been assigned. Would Brooklyn have become so controlling if she'd felt free to be imperfect? Would I have grown so vigilant if someone, anyone, had listened to my truth sooner? Yet, as the dust settled and months passed, a kind of stilted equilibrium took hold. Brooklyn and I found a new rhythm. Not friends, not rivals, but wary siblings, circling a detente, forged by fatigue and hard-won mutual boundaries. Family dinners became less about competition and more about coexistence. We learned how to navigate each other's company with tentative respect, each of us nursing invisible bruises. For my part, I found myself stepping into a new version of adulthood, one built not on defending myself, but on nurturing authentic connections. I stayed close to those who valued my honesty, who showed up with kindness even when my history made trust difficult. Surprisingly, some of this warmth reached even Brooklyn on her most vulnerable days. There were rare, flickering moments, over coffee or during rainy afternoons, when she seemed willing to drop her guard. We spoke then not of the past, but of small hopes and cautious dreams. These moments didn't heal everything, but they offered brief detours from the blame and regret that had defined our connection. Through it all, my biggest realization was that consequences aren't always the punishments we expect. Sometimes they're invitations to reckon with ourselves in ways neither victory nor defeat could have predicted. Brooklyn spent long months in the wilderness, outside the family's easy embrace, but it forced her to begin her own confrontation with her loneliness, her insecurities, her reasons for controlling others in the first place. I don't pretend to know what went through her heart during those late nights in her childhood bedroom or on quiet walks through our old neighborhood, but I knew she was changing. The force of consequence nudged her toward self-examination, and in the softening of her edges, something like humility began to grow. One afternoon, late in the year, Brooklyn surprised me. She showed up at my apartment in the city with a tentative knock and a plastic container of cookies. Her way, I guessed, of olive branching without words. We sat awkwardly on my couch, passing the plate back and forth, and talked about anything but our history. At some point, she blurted, "I didn't think things would end up like this." There was no anger, just fatigue. I nodded, unsure of what comfort I could give, but tried anyway. Maybe it's not the end, just a new beginning where we don't have to keep pretending. That day wasn't a clean slate. We still had our baggage, our habits of silence, but it was a moment where consequence brought us, finally, to the same fragile ground. We both understood, maybe for the first time, the cost of pinning our happiness on someone else's downfall or approval. In the following months, our relationship found a plateau. Not close, but not adversarial either. We created a truce of sorts, bound not by forgiveness, but recognition. Brooklyn started working on herself. Therapy, volunteering, reaching out to people she'd once pushed away. Sometimes she'd update me. Sometimes she'd slip back into her prickly old defenses. The difference was, I saw her as a whole person now, capable of both harm and healing, just like me. Family life began to rebuild on new terms. I spoke my truth, but with less edge and more curiosity. My parents grew softer with Brooklyn as she confronted her own regret, giving her space to change without subjecting me to the old games. The air was clearer, the power struggles fewer. For the first time, our family felt like a place where growth was possible, even if it wasn't always comfortable or pretty. One thing stayed with me through all of it: the realization that standing up for myself hadn't just saved me from Brooklyn's influence, it had also saved her, in a strange way, from the prison of her own making. Confronting her manipulation allowed everyone to step toward something healthier, more honest, albeit messier. I didn't relish her losses, but I did treasure my ability to move, finally, without shame or apology. Reflecting on those months, I saw how the unavoidable consequences rippled outward, changing friendships, shifting loyalties, and redefining how we all related to one another. Siblings, I realized, can wound one another deeply, but they can also hold up mirror after mirror, forcing us to confront what we'd rather not see. Brooklyn's isolation echoed the loneliness I'd once carried. Her slow journey toward self-awareness mirrored my own, just playing out in reverse. And, as the dust finally settled, I stopped looking for a dramatic finish or perfect restoration. The story, I learned, wasn't about whose pain mattered more. It was about learning the shapes of consequence, how every action, every silence, every withheld apology leaves its mark. Brooklyn was no longer the all-powerful architect of the narrative or the villain in mine. She was simply my sister, trying to find her own peace in the aftermath of a war we both fought too long. That knowledge, the understanding of cause and effect, and our shared, bruised humanity became the soil for forgiveness. Not the easy Hollywood kind, but the slow, honest sort that grows when both people finally stand in the truth. That was the unavoidable consequence I never expected. Discovering freedom, not just for myself, but for both of us. Looking back and moving forward, now that so much time and emotional distance stand between me in the turbulent heart of my sister's story, I often find myself looking back, not with regret, but with a puzzled, gentle curiosity for the person I used to be, in the future that keeps unfolding before me. When I was young, I never imagined that one day the storm would quiet and I would see my life not only as survival, but as a patchwork of resilience, lessons, and hard-won freedom. There's no way to chart a perfect line from where I was to where I am now, but the act of reflection reshapes every jagged fragment into something almost beautiful. For years, my world revolved around the axis of my sister's manipulation and the roles family and friends assigned us. I learned to dance around conflict, to anticipate mood swings, to strategize every interaction. A toolkit built for self-preservation, but not for living. I still remember the feeling of waking up each day as a teenager, bracing myself for the subtle battles that defined daily life. A cutting remark, a calculated silence, the constant need for caution. That era colored everything, casting long shadows over my aspirations and sense of self. But now, in the cold light of adulthood, I realize that the same vigilance that kept me bound to her games has become a gift. I notice things others might miss. A small change in a friend's tone, the hesitation behind a compliment, the way a crowd's attention drifts in a room. What once felt like hyper-awareness, born of defensiveness, is now a kind of social fluency. I can build bridges, de-escalate conflict, and support others, because I know so well what isolation feels like. That's a legacy I can claim as my own, separate from the pain that shaped it. I wonder sometimes if Brooklyn reflects on those years too. The aftershocks of our rivalry echo into the present. Family get-togethers feel different. Conversations that once revolved around her are more evenly shared, less scripted. We speak occasionally, voices softer than they were, careful not to retread old battlegrounds. There is no dramatic reconciliation, no apologies that right every wrong, but a tentative acknowledgement between us. We are both older, wounded, and wary, yet stubbornly hopeful that the future might offer more than just détente. One truth that emerges as I sift through old memories is that real growth is never linear. I wanted, at so many points, to leave all the baggage behind and run headlong into a fresh start. Life had other plans. Even now, when I make new friends or start a new job, there is a little voice, sometimes timid, sometimes defiant, that asks if I'm being judged as the second best, the quieter one, the afterthought. Letting go of those old scripts is a daily practice. I've learned to challenge them with evidence. The loyal friends who trust me, the work achievements I earned by merit, the laughter at group dinners where no one's overshadowed, reconciliation within my family, and, more crucially, within myself, has looked nothing like what I used to fantasize about during sleepless nights. There was a time when I wanted Brooklyn to suffer as I had, to recognize every slight, to fall as hard as I once did. That hunger for justice or retribution faded over time, tempered by empathy and perspective. I see now that damage perpetuates itself unless someone chooses another way. I am that person now, not because I won or because forgiveness is easy, but because I finally understand that the only person whose acceptance I truly needed was my own. The journey toward healing has not been without its setbacks. Some days, echoes of old insecurities return. A stray comment from a colleague can make my shoulders tense, in the same way my sister's words once did. Praise sometimes feels like a setup for disappointment. I still catch myself apologizing for things that aren't my fault or hesitating to voice my needs. But the difference now is that I see these moments for what they are. Remnants of a survival instinct, no longer required. My inner monologue has grown kinder, more patient. I remind myself often, you made it through worse. You can make it through today. I've started to approach my relationship with my parents differently as well. The same people who once overlooked my quiet struggles are now among my confidants. Though it's been a gradual shift, I learned that sometimes you have to teach people how to see you, especially when they've spent a lifetime overlooking your pain. Through honest conversations, often raw, sometimes awkward, we've built new connections based on curiosity, not comparison. They ask more questions now. They listen for the answers. And I find myself sharing insights and dreams I once kept hidden out of self-preservation. If nothing else, it's proof that family bonds, while fraught, can evolve into something sturdy, given time and honest effort. Professionally, the impact has been unexpectedly positive. The ability to read tension, to negotiate quietly, and to find compromise has made me an asset in spaces where conflict runs rampant. I gravitate toward roles with space for empathy: team leader, advisor, problem solver. My past informs my work, not by defining me as damaged, but by reminding me what genuine support can do for someone who's always felt peripheral. I've become the ally I once wished I had, and that feels like the most radical form of healing. I also learned to extend grace to myself regarding relationships outside my family. Friendships, I realized, aren't built only on shared history or blood. They're constructed in hundreds of tiny acts. The friend who checks in after a tough day, the roommate who knows how to cheer me up, the mentor who champions my growth without expectation. These connections break old patterns. I am not an accessory in anyone else's story, and I try to ensure no one ever feels that way around me. The humility gained from being overlooked is a gentle, stubborn refusal to let others fall through the cracks on my watch. Brooklyn's evolution, though far from my responsibility, has become a quiet subplot in this new chapter of my life. It's tempting, sometimes, to look at her through the lens of former wounds, to watch for old habits in how she moves through the world. But growing older has brought a new clarity. She, too, was a product of pressures neither of us fully understood. The pressure to be perfect, to compete for love, to mold herself to expectations set long before either of us could consent. Occasionally, we share a knowing glance during family events, a brief mutual acknowledgement of our former roles. The distance between us isn't just physical or emotional. It's layered with unspoken apologies and, perhaps, a flicker of pride that we both broke free in our own way. Of course, the legacy of our history isn't erased. I sometimes grieve for the carefree sisterhood we never had. There are still awkward silences, still conversations best left alone. But now, those gaps feel like wounds that are healing, not festering. I don't expect that we'll ever be best friends, but my heart is open to small, incremental trust, the kind that's fragile but real. Family isn't always about reconciliation. Sometimes it's about releasing the need to be fully understood. We are both trying, and for now, that's enough. Looking forward, I am determined to live unconstrained by the narratives of my youth. It took years to realize that the power to define my life was always, stubbornly, quietly mine. I want future chapters to be defined less by old wounds and more by curiosity, adventure, and self-forgiveness. I look for opportunities to take risks, to say yes to new friendships, to set boundaries before old patterns resurface. I am learning how to trust not just others, but my own judgment, believing, finally, that I am neither the sum of my sister's criticisms nor the shadow to her light, but something altogether different. As life moves onward, I keep with me the quiet victories that once felt unreachable, the ability to speak without fear of interruption, the warmth of chosen friendships, the simple pride of living authentically. I find myself offering advice to others, siblings tangled in similar rivalries, friends grappling with complicated pasts, not as a self-help cliché, but as someone who's lived every messy step. My honest hope is that Brooklyn, too, continues to find her own way, free from the burden of playing the lead in a story that never let either of us be whole. Standing here, full of scars, stories, and the complicated grace of survival, I finally know what I wish I'd known all along, that life is bigger than any rivalry, trauma, or label. Moving forward isn't about forgetting or forgiving everything, but about building something truer out of what remains. I no longer measure my worth by someone else's spotlight. My story, hard-fought and fiercely owned, is entirely, beautifully my own.